Miss Peyton is our model this morning, and what I've got, the very first illustration I have for you this morning is, it just kind of fits right into it. I told her that I would not embarrass her, and I'm not going to embarrass her. But do y'all see what she's wearing? Turn sideways, Peyton. Can y'all see her jeans? Can you see the bottom of them?
Bell bottoms.
Huh? Can you see the bottom of them?
Bell bottoms.
Bell bottoms. Okay?
They come full circle.
They come full circle. Peyton, when I was 14 years old, which that was a long time ago, I remember wearing a pair of those. And my uncle flew me from Chicago to Atlanta to meet my dad. Well, I was 15, somewhere around there. And I remember walking through the airport, and I had me on a pair of blue jean bell bottoms. They were so big you could not see my shoes.
The big bell. Big bell.
Big bells.
Yeah, man.
Big
They had to
bells.
blow in the wind, you know.
Yeah, big bells. And I strutted through that airport. I was cool. I was groovy. We just want to see your bell bottoms because it's going to be part of what we're teaching this morning. You can go back there and Miss Katie and then get ready. But it's like somebody said, it's come full circle. And I don't know. It's just strange, isn't it? It's just strange.
My daughter signed a piece of paper that said she'd never wear bell bottoms. I don't think she ever has.
Really?
Yeah. I had to write it out and sign it. I said, "You'll wear them one day." No, I won't. She said.
I won't either.
Still got that paper somewhere.
Still have that paper somewhere.
I'm waiting.
But have you ever sat around and wondered how things have changed over the years? And I'm going to give some illustrations this morning, and I'm going to give you some examples. And I Googled these examples. And so, if some of them, hopefully I picked out the ones that were not appropriate. Alright? I tried to, because some of them I've never heard of. But I Googled these, and and I apologize if some of them may seem inappropriate or something. I don't think they will. But I wish Elvin was here, because some of these I've never heard of. And I'm going to give you some slang words. Alright? Maureen's here, so she can probably help me. I'm going to start in 1950 with some slang words. All right? 1950, a slang word was Antsville. Antsville. Antsville meant a congested bunch of people. It was just a group of people. That was Antsville. What about a tank? Tank. It was a car. It was a slang word for a car.
Big car.
Big car.
Big car, yeah.
All right, this one here.
Or boat.
Boat. Ain't that a bite? That meant that's too bad. And then flip your lid. Going crazy. Alright, we'll jump to the 60s. This was when my era, but I was still young. I don't remember all of these. Okay? But the 60s, far out. I mean, awesome. Okay? Alright, this one here, I missed out on this one. It was Bogart.
Yeah.
Bella, what are you laughing for? Huh? Bogart. Bogart meant to keep everything for yourself,
Yep.
especially a lit marijuana cigarette. Is that still true today? If you're Bogarting, you're hoarding the lit marijuana cigarette. Okay? Don't flip your wig. In other words, don't get upset. A square with someone who isn't cool. Alright, now we're getting to the 70s. These are the ones that might be a little questionable. And I've never heard of this one. I'm going to try it, make sure that I don't embarrass myself, but it says, ah, Suki Suki. Ellie, you remember that? You remember that? Ah, Suki Suki. It meant, oh yeah, baby.
You gotta say it right. You gotta say, ah.
Oh, well, I'm not going I will embarrass myself. Ashley, you can edit the redness of my face.
That's talking about dessert, man.
Yeah. Jeepers Creepers.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Up your nose with a rubber hose. Means I'm really mad at you. Okay, this in here. Wally Wally, Blood and Dolly.
Not familiar with that one.
You don't remember that one? Wally Wally, Blood and Dolly. You can Google that, and it means you're crazy about someone in a very irrational way. Now, I never heard of that. Like I said, the 70s, that's kind of, I wasn't into stuff like that. But in the 80s, a space cadet was somebody that was clueless or a ditzy person. All right?
You just said another word.
Ditzy.
Ditzy.
Yeah. All right. Funky flesh.
I've heard of funky, but not funky flesh.
Funky flesh means very cool or good. All right. Cowabunga. Cowabunga. A statement of praise and excitement. We could all start hollering, Cowabunga God. Now, hey, what? Has to be a turtle. The last one here is tubular. Tubular.
It's a surfing term.
That's a surfing term. If Mike was still here, he would know what that meant. It's tubular, dude.
You gotta say it with an accent. Wow, man, that's tubular.
That's tubular.
You gotta say, hey,
Now, they had some with the Valley Girls and all that other stuff on there, but I didn't want to get it. I mean, when I Googled all this, they give me about 10 or 12 in each decade, and I had to go through. I thought, man, I ain't got that much time.
What about out of sight, man? You gotta
Out of
have out of sight.
That's out of sight. But I wonder if Noah ever sat around and wondered back before he created the Noah and Sons Marina type organization. Wonder if he ever sat around and thought about how things were different back in the day. Wonder if he and the wife ever Googled stuff and thought how things have changed in my lifetime. And you got to think, things probably did change in Noah's lifetime. I just went back 50 years or 70, really. Noah was 500 years old. So a lot of things did change in Noah's lifetime. He's seen a lot of changes. Because there is a lot went on between Genesis 2 and Genesis 6. It's 1,650 years. And Noah's seen about a third of it. And Noah was unusual. When you think of Noah, you think of one word. And faith is not the word you should think of. But it's a result of faith. Let's look at Genesis 6, verse 22. It says, so Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. Let's look at 7, verse 5. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. Let's look at verse 9. And here the animals came and entered the ark in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. Noah was obedient. That's the one word you need to know about when you think of Noah. When you think of Noah, we need to think of obedience. Most of us don't have a problem knowing what to do we? Most of us have a pretty good idea of what we're doing, but we do, though we struggle with our choices. Our willingness to do what we know we should do. In other words, we wrestle with being obedient. We're going to look at Noah and see that strong faith in God that Noah had. That kind of faith that allows us to be the most radical, or have the most radical acts of obedience. Radical could be one of those words that we used back in the day. But strong faith in God will empower us. It will enable us. It will allow us to be obedient to God. Allstate Insurance did a survey of Californians. And these Californians lived in earthquake-prone regions. And 64% of the respondents say they believed a massive earthquake would hit in the near future. But only 1 out of 4, or 1 in 4, has earthquake insurance. Well, I imagine trying to buy earthquake insurance in California is trying to kind of like buy flood insurance in Louisiana. You know, you probably can't afford it. But Jerry Bridges, this is a quote from him. He said, "A belief is something you hold, and a conviction is something that holds you." One feature of faith is that it has to be unseen. We don't have faith in the things that we can see, do we? Faith involves the assurance of things not seen. It was like Paul said, we live by believing, not by seeing. In other words, we walk by faith, not by sight. Hebrews 11, verse 7. And the first one I put up here, this is actually the middle part of this verse. And Noah was warned about things that had never happened before. Think about it. Nothing like the flood had ever happened before. It may be that rain had never been seen before. If you read Genesis 2, verses 5 through 6, and this is the second half of verse 5, it says, God had not yet sent rain to water the earth. Instead, springs came up from the ground and watered the land. Now that would be something to see, wouldn't it? You didn't see rain fall from the sky, it came from the ground. So things had not, people had not seen rain before. And they sure had not seen a sea-going vessel like the ark, had they? The ark defied human reasoning. They just didn't understand it. And it also, another reason is because it was big. It was big. It was a big waste of time. Terry's got a couple of pictures she's supposed to bounce back and forth through here. The ark was big, and it was a big waste of time. I don't know why they put Alabama on there for. Duel, I'm sorry. I just now noticed that. I thought that said Arkansas. But to get an idea of the size of the ark, and if you look at the descriptions of the ark that God gave Noah, He didn't tell him to put no bow on the front of it or nothing like that. He basically told him to build a square box. And this is kind of gives you a reference to the size of the ark. To get an idea, the ark was 45 foot high. You know, nobody's seen anything like this. It was 45 foot high. That's 4.5 stories. All right? The Gravette Hospital on this side is 3 stories. If you take half of that hospital and stack it on top of the rest of it, that's how tall it was. Okay? Now if you look across the sanctuary, from that wall to that wall is about how wide the ark was. And this is the hard part, the tough part that I got to get you to visualize. It was 450 foot long. Terry, go to the next picture, number 2. It was 452 foot long. Or 450, it says 510 there. But that's a football, 1.5 football fields, which we've seen on the other picture. That's 1.5 football fields long. The ark had over 100,000 square foot of floor space. By the time you put all the stories together, it had over 100,000 square foot of storage, floor space. Now, if your house is 2,000 square feet, that's 500 of those houses. Or, if you want to think back when they first came out with the Walmart Supercenters, that was about 100,000 square feet. They're about twice the size of that now. But another theory you can use, and Joe, you can use this one. You take 500 railroad boxcars, and you stack them up like blocks, one on top of one another and side by side. And that's about how big the ark was. 500 railroad boxcars stacked up like blocks. Now, for Noah and his Noah and the Sons Marine Service, for them to build that, took a lot of wood, didn't it? Took a lot of time. Took a lot of time to build it, to a lot of cutting and fitting and lifting and loading and hauling, and around 100 years it took for a crew of 4. Now, which obedience is unreasonable? God being, or Noah and his sons being obedient to God, which of these obedience is unreasonable? One, because it's something that we can't see the results of. Is that us being obedient? Is it something we can't see the results of? Or is it something that just sounds like too much work? You're thinking, well, we're not building an ark here. We're not. So how does that fit with us? We'll think of it this way. How about financial giving? We often don't see the result. That serving ourselves, do we? It's a lot of work for some. And the world says that it's not rational. What about loving our enemies? Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who persecute you. We can't see how that goes to help us, do we? We can't see that helping us in any situation. So why should we do it? It's not reasonable. What about baptism? There's nothing spectacular about it. It doesn't change anything about our appearance. We can't prove it by our senses that it means anything. The world would say it's not reasonable. But God says it is part of becoming His. Die to yourself, Jesus said. Well, that's not reasonable. To live what Jesus said, to die to yourself, that just doesn't sound like life, does it? Still, those that list that I give you are matters of obedience, aren't they? How can we do that? How can we do that? We can do it just like Noah did. Just like Noah and his 3 sons when they built that floating stadium. Just like it says in Hebrews 7, or Hebrews 11, verse 7. Very first part of that, it says, it was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. Think about it. Noah didn't build a big old boat just for him and the missus, did he? He didn't build that big boat just for him and the 8 people in his family. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Even though by human reasoning, it wasn't reasonable. But it was radical obedience. Jesus was the one child. Think about it. Especially when they get up teenage years. But Jesus was the one child that knew more than his parents did. Jeff, someday Josie's going to think she knows more than you.
Yeah.
We're there? Okay. Jesus was the one child that knew more than his parents did, but he obeyed them. He obeyed them. Have you ever heard of people being obedient to God even when it wasn't reasonable? How did they do it? By faith. Strong faith in God allows us to be obedient. Noah was a preacher of righteousness to his generation. In the last part of verse 7 here in chapter 11, it says that Noah commanded the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. But Noah wasn't the only one in history who obeyed when everybody else did. You remember Job? Job suffered without any explanation. His children had died. He had lost everything he had, including his health. And he remained obedient. His wife, though, she voted differently. She said, "Won't you just cuss God or curse God and die?" But Job opted for obedience. He knew it was the right thing to do. Remember Shadrach and the boys? They were far from home. In fact, their home was gone. It was destroyed. And everyone else was bowing before the king's idol. But those three guys wouldn't. Even though everyone around them had their faces in the dirt, they were still standing. Remember Daniel? His enemies, they come up with this idea that it was against the law to pray. But Daniel kept praying. 3 times a day with his windows open. No one else was in trouble for being obedient. But Daniel was. The album cover of Keith Green's album, No Compromise. Now, I don't know if you can see that very good or not, but what it's showing, it's a scene there in the ancient Middle East. There's a king being carried on a litter. Is that how you say that? And he's being carried by these muscle-bound dudes. Then there's this some-looking guy, some bodyguard-looking guy on a horse in the background there, and he's pointing for everybody to bow down. For everybody to bow down and worship the king that's going by. But there's this one guy, this one plain-looking guy standing there. And I don't know if you can see it very good, but the guy next to him has got him by the robe, and he's trying to pull him down and get him to bow down and worship the king. But this obedient servant of the King of the universe won't bow down. He will not bow to any man. No compromise. No compromise. Thank you, Terry. Just like it's easier to get in trouble when you hang out with people who are getting in trouble. It's easy to get in trouble when you're hanging out with the folks that are the ones getting in trouble. Obedience. When no one else is obeying. It's hard, isn't it? How can we do it? The same way Job did. The first part of verse 7. It says, by faith, or I say Noah, I said Job, I mean Noah. By faith, Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before. Do we trust God to reward our obedience? Do we believe God that our spiritual decisions are going to result in blessings? Do we believe God when He says He has good plans for us? Plans for something better? When we see people at work stealing stuff, or people cheating the time clock, I don't know if they can do that anymore. They used to be able to do it. Huh? They still can do it? Still can cheat the time clock? How do we remain obedient? How can we be the only one? Do we trust God to bless our honesty, to bless our integrity? Do we believe God will provide for us with what we need for our honesty? When we hear everybody around us criticizing someone's character, how do we keep from joining in? We're upset too. Because they did something to damage us. So how do we keep from being a backbiter as well? Do we trust God to protect the upright? Do we believe God when He says, vengeance is mine, I will repay? Do we have that faith? God looked at the world in the days of Noah, and it was 1,500 years old. So there was a lot of people around about that time. It says in Genesis 6, verse 5, it says, the Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and He saw that everything they thought or imagined was constantly and totally evil. We'll skip down to verse 12. It says, God observed all this corruption in this world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. But Noah was able to be obedient, even when the rest of the world wasn't. Do you believe God when He says in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience? And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you. He will show you a way out so that you can endure. You believe that? Faith. Faith will enable me. Faith will allow me. Faith will authorize me. It will permit me. It will entitle me. Faith will empower me be obedient when the crowd around me isn't. So just how important is this obedience stuff anyway? Noah's obedience saved his life. Look at it this way. When a doctor writes you a prescription, obedience in his directions are pretty important, aren't they? Wouldn't you say that it would save your life? Well, Noah did. Noah got a prescription, and it saved his life. Obedience is the most necessary to us when it means the difference between life and death. But not only did Noah save himself, he saved his wife. He saved his sons. He saved his daughters-in-law. By his obedience to God. Now don't think for a second that your obedience is just a personal matter between you and God. Because it's not. Noah's obedience just wasn't for him and his family. Faith is most necessary when it spells the difference between life and death for your family. Noah's obedience saved all the animals, didn't it? God could have made them all again from scratch, didn't he? Couldn't he? But he didn't. That wasn't his plan. God's plan was instead a lesson in obedience for Noah and for us. There are several examples in the Bible that shows God's plans is dependent on our obedience from faith. When Noah saved himself and his family, he saved the entire human race. The radical obedience of Noah's faith saved the human race from destruction. God could have started over from scratch again, couldn't he? But he didn't. And what is his plan? But in his wisdom, God chose to teach a lesson of obedience for Noah and for us. God could have chosen another way, but he recorded the life of Noah by giving us a lesson. So how can I be obedient like that? How can I be obedient when it's the most necessary? When lives are in the balance, hanging by whether I'll be obedient to God or not. How can I constantly live out my Christianity? How can I witness boldly that destruction is coming? And there is a lifeboat that we can get on, that we can get in. How can I be real? How can I be genuine and effective when the crowd around me isn't? But when it matters the most, we trust God, don't we? Don't we believe his promise to stand by us and to help us? So I need help being obedient. How about you? There is a faith that leads to obedience, that leads to radical obedience. Building a floating zoo on dry land type of obedience. It's going to take more than a good upbringing to be obedient like that. It's going to take more than determination. It's going to take more than we can do on our own. It's going to take radical obedience. Now I'll close with this, Jen. A few centuries before Jesus, about 3 or so, there was a man named Alexander. And Alexander conquered almost all of the known world using military strength, cleverness, and a little diplomacy. The story is told that Alexander and a small company of soldiers approached a little strong, fortified, walled little city. And Alexander stood outside the city, and he yelled inside and wanted to see the king. But when the king come to the wall, he asked him, he said, "What do you want?" Alexander told him. He said, "I want you to surrender your city and all its inhabitants to me." Well, the king just laughed at him. He said, "Why should I surrender to you? You can't do anything to harm me." Alexander said, "Well, let me give you a little demonstration." He ordered his men to line up in a single file and start marching. And they marched in a straight line, straight towards a sheer cliff. And the townspeople gathered on the wall to watch in disbelief as his men kept marching. And one by one, Alexander's soldiers marched without any hesitation right off the cliff to their death. Well, when about 10 of them had died, Alexander ordered the rest of them to come stand beside him. And the townspeople and the king immediately surrendered to Alexander the Great. They realized that a few men were actually willing to commit suicide at the command of a passionate leader. And then they noticed that they wouldn't be able to stop his eventual victory. So are we willing to be obedient to the ruler of the universe, Christ Jesus, as those soldiers were to Alexander? Are we dedicated and committed? Do we have that kind of radical obedience? Think of how much power of Jesus would be seen in our community if we would allow him to exercise that kind of power. Amen? Radical obedience. Radical obedience. That's what's on the front of your bulletin this morning. And that's the kind of obedience that we need to work towards. I started to say start showing, but we need to work towards that type of obedience. Obedience to the King of the universe. Alexander's men were obedient to him. I done some looking on Alexander. When he conquered most of the known world at the time, he was 25 years old. I would have thought he would have been an old guy, but he was real young when he did that. Beside the point, we need to have that kind of obedience. We need to have the kind of obedience that Noah had. Noah's seen a lot of things change. We've seen a lot of things change. In our 16 plus years, Brady. So we need to have that type of obedience. Amen?